On tape number 312, recorded on the afternoon of November 7, 2019, in room 4 of the Cedarwood Hospice in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, a dying man named Gerald Hoth whispers his final confession to the chaplain. And when the chaplain plays the tape back that same evening, a second voice responds to every single thing Gerald said, in a tone so calm and so knowing that Father Dominic Reyes drops the recorder, backs into his kitchen wall, and doesn't sleep for 11 days. By the time the full archive is examined, all 312 tapes, spanning 22 years, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss, impossible to explain, and impossible to forget. Because the voice answering back isn't Gerald's. It isn't Dominic's. And the forensic audio team brought in from Philadelphia will confirm, with clinical certainty, that the voice on every single tape belongs to the same person. A person who, by every available record, has never once set foot inside that hospice. Father Dominic Reyes came to Cedarwood in 1997, when he was 34 years old and still believed, as he would later say, that God was something you could feel in a room. He was a compact, quietly intense man with dark eyes that people often described as too still, the kind of eyes that had learned to absorb grief without flinching. He wore the same black cardigan almost every day, slightly pilled at the elbows, and he smelled perpetually of instant coffee and the particular antiseptic sweetness of hospice corridors, that layered smell that's half lavender cleaning fluid and half something older and warmer and harder to name. He wasn't appointed to Cedarwood so much as drawn there. He had requested it. He had wanted, he said during his original application, to be present at the threshold, to sit with people as they crossed it, to be useful specifically in the place where most people couldn't stand to be. Cedarwood itself was a converted Victorian house on the edge of town, set back from Marshfield Road behind two enormous copper beech trees that turned the light amber in summer and stripped down to something skeletal and reaching by November. The building had 15 rooms, pale green walls, and windows that were always slightly ajar regardless of the season. A policy, the nursing staff explained, to maintain air circulation, though several of the longer-serving nurses admitted privately that the original matron had believed something else entirely. That you needed to leave a window open. That something needed a way out. Dominic began recording in 1997 on the advice of his spiritual director, a retired Jesuit named Father Alban Morse, who told him that the words spoken at the end of a life were the most honest words a human being would ever produce, and that he had a responsibility to preserve them. Not for publication. Not for the institution. For what Alban called the permanent record. Dominic bought a standard tape recorder from a Radio Shack in Scranton. A Sony TCM 939, cream-colored, the size of a paperback novel, and began carrying it to every bedside session. He would set it on the nightstand, press record, and simply be present. He would listen. He would pray when asked. He would hold hands when needed. And he would, occasionally, ask the gentle and open-ended questions that tended to loosen what had been held tightly for decades. The confessions he collected over those first few years were, by his own description, extraordinary in their ordinariness. Affairs admitted to, money taken, children never called back, small cruelties, large silences, the whole topography of a human life collapsing down to what mattered and what had been left undone. He listened to every tape within 24 hours of recording it. He kept them in order in a series of gray archive boxes stored in the locked lower cabinet of his office desk. He labeled each one in his careful, small handwriting, patient number, date, room. He never once, in those first years, heard anything on those tapes other than what had been said in that room. A voice, sometimes weeping, occasionally the squeak of the corridor trolley outside, the low thrum of the building's ancient heating system cycling on. Normal sounds, expected sounds. And that is what makes what happened in 2003 so difficult to explain. Because on the evening of March 14, 2003, Dominic sat at his desk in the small office adjacent to the chapel, pressed play on that day's tape, a 90-minute session with a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher named Margaret Olin, room 9, and heard, for the first time, a voice answer her. He assumed it was his own. He leaned closer, listening hard. But his voice on the tape was where it should be, quiet, intermittent, the soft prompt of a question asked at the 20-minute mark. This other voice was different. It came between Margaret's words, came in the silences, and what it said, in that low and almost gentle register, was a direct response to every confession Margaret had just made. As though it had been sitting right there beside her. As though it had been listening too. As though it had been waiting far longer than Dominic had. He sat with that tape for 2 hours before he finally pressed stop. And then he opened the lower cabinet, took out every tape he had ever recorded, and began going back through all of them from the very beginning. Took him 4 nights. 4 nights of sitting alone in that small office with the desk lamp burning and the building settling around him in the dark. Feeding tape after tape into the recorder. Listening back through 22 years of dying people's final words. He barely ate. He drank so much instant coffee that his hands developed a fine, persistent tremor he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The corridor outside stayed quiet. The night nurses moved like shadows past his door. Nobody knocked. It was as if the building understood that something was happening in that room and had decided, collectively, to give it space. What he found was this. The voice was on every single tape. Not prominently, not always loudly. On some of the earlier recordings, the ones from 1997 and 1998, it was so faint that Dominic had to press the recorder directly against his ear and hold his breath to catch it. But it was there. He could feel it before he could fully hear it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. A kind of thickening in the silence between one person's words and the next. And then, if you listened closely enough, patiently enough, there it was. Low and unhurried. Precise. Responding to things the patients had said with the attentiveness of someone who had been sitting in that room for a very long time. On tape 7, from September 1997, a man named Clifford Beer confessed to Dominic that he had been the one driving the night his brother died in a car accident in 1962. Not his brother, as the family had always believed, as the police report had stated, as the headstone had implied. He had switched seats in the dark. He had been 17. He had never told anyone. His voice on the tape was barely above a breath. A man finally putting down something he had carried for 40 years. And in the silence after he finished speaking, in the 2 or 3 seconds before Dominic murmured his response, the other voice said, quietly and without judgment, "I know. I was there." Dominic had to stop the tape. He sat in the dark for a while. Then he pressed play again. On tape 34, from 2001, a woman named Elsa Vance described with terrible precision how she had deliberately misled her younger sister about their mother's will, ensuring the sister received nothing. She cried through most of it. The other voice responded in what sounded almost like comfort. Not absolving her, not condemning her, but acknowledging her, in that soft, uninflected tone, with 3 words Dominic would later transcribe into his notebook in handwriting that was noticeably less steady than usual. "She forgave you." Elsa Vance's sister had died in 2000, 14 months before the tape was recorded. On tape 91, from 2006, a retired engineer named Thomas Galt spent 40 minutes describing in exhaustive, precise detail the specific mechanics of a bridge safety report he had falsified in 1983. A bridge in Luzerne County. A bridge that had partially collapsed in 1987, injuring 11 people, killing 3. He had falsified the report to meet a deadline. He had never come forward. He had spent 19 years constructing a version of events in which his role was peripheral, circumstantial, almost accidental. And he had mostly believed it the way people do, the way the mind protects itself. On the tape, as he described the 3rd victim, a 23-year-old woman named Carol Dietz, who had been crossing the bridge on her way to a job interview. His voice cracked in a way that suggested the version he'd built was finally, after all those years, collapsing. The other voice waited until he finished. And then it said,